There is a law moving through Washington right now that most people have never heard of. It has no flashy name, no press conference, no breaking news banner. But if it passes the way it is written, it could completely change who gets to build software in America, who gets to share it, and who gets to use it for free. And here is the part that should make you stop scrolling. The people who stand to lose the most are not billion-dollar tech companies. They are volunteers, developers working from their bedrooms, people who spent decades building something they believed in, something they gave away because they thought knowledge should belong to everyone. We are talking about more than 600 Linux distributions: Fedora, Debian, Arch, Kali, Mint, Tails, and dozens more that most people have never heard of, but that quietly power the internet, hospitals, schools, governments, and the machines that hold modern civilization together. All of them potentially caught in the crosshairs of a piece of legislation written by people who may not know the difference between open source software and a foreign adversary. So what is this law? Where did it come from? And why is almost nobody talking about it? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what is happening, why it matters, and why it is moving faster than most people think. To understand where we are, you need to go back to the end of World War II. After the war, the United States government built an elaborate system of export controls. The idea was pretty simple. America develops advanced technology. Some of that technology can be used to build weapons or give strategic advantages to enemy nations, so the government created rules about what could be sent abroad and to whom. For decades, this system worked reasonably well because the world was made of physical things. You could track a shipment of semiconductors. You could monitor the sale of aircraft engines. The system was designed for things you could put in a box and put on a boat. Then the internet arrived. And suddenly, software became something you could distribute to 1 million people in 100 countries in seconds for free, without a box, without a boat, and without asking anyone's permission. The export control system had no idea what to do with that. In the 1990s, there were famous battles over whether encryption software counted as a weapon, whether publishing cryptographic code online was an illegal act of arms export. Developers were treated like arms dealers. Researchers were afraid to publish their own work. Those battles were largely won by the open source community. The government eventually acknowledged that publishing code was a form of protected speech, that open source software required different treatment than a missile guidance system. A hard-fought compromise was reached, and that compromise held for over 2 decades. Until now. Inside the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is a division of the United States Department of Commerce, a new framework is being quietly developed. It is built around what are called export administration regulations, and it is being updated to account for a changed world. The specific concern driving this update is artificial intelligence. Policymakers are genuinely worried. And honestly, some of that worry makes sense. Advanced AI models trained on massive datasets with enormous computational resources could give real strategic military advantages to adversarial nations. China is the explicit concern in most of the policy documents, and that concern is not entirely without merit. But here is where the problem begins. In writing rules to control AI software, the regulators are using language broad enough to potentially capture almost any software that involves machine learning, data processing, or cryptography. And because Linux distributions bundle hundreds of software packages together, including encryption tools, networking tools, and increasingly AI-related libraries, they could fall under the definition of controlled technology. Think about that for a second. A Linux distribution that a teenager in Ohio put together on the weekends, hosted for free on GitHub, used by hobbyists and security students around the world, could technically be classified the same way as military-grade export-controlled technology. The draft language does not say Linux is banned. It does not name any specific distribution. What it does is create a category of software that requires a license before it can be exported or, in some interpretations, even published openly online where foreign nationals could access it. And here is where things get very real, very fast. Let me make this concrete. Let's say you maintain a small Linux distribution. Nothing crazy, maybe 10,000 users worldwide. You host your project on GitHub. Anyone in any country can download your files. Under this new framework, that simple act of hosting could be interpreted as an unlicensed export of controlled technology. You would now be required to apply for an export license, document who is downloading your software, screen users against a denied party list, maintain compliance records, hire a lawyer to review your project. And if you fail to do any of that, civil penalties start at hundreds of thousands of dollars per violation. For a corporation with a legal department, that is annoying but manageable. For a volunteer maintaining a Linux project from their apartment, it is potentially career-ending liability. This is not a hypothetical doomsday scenario. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and several prominent open-source attorneys have already filed formal objections to the regulatory language being developed. Their argument is clear. The framework as written creates a compliance burden so severe that it would effectively shut down every small and medium open-source project in the country. The only survivors would be large corporations with the legal and financial infrastructure to handle export compliance. Companies like Red Hat, owned by IBM, companies like Canonical, which backs Ubuntu. The little guy gets crushed, the big corporation survives, and the incredible diversity of the open source world quietly collapses. Now let's talk about why that diversity matters way more than most people realize. Different Linux distributions exist for radically different reasons and serve radically different populations. Tails OS exists specifically to protect journalists and dissidents living under authoritarian regimes. When a reporter in a dangerous country needs to communicate without being tracked, Tails is often the tool they use. Cube's OS is used by security researchers and privacy advocates who need extreme levels of isolation between tasks. Some of the most security-conscious individuals on the planet use it, including people who work inside intelligence agencies. Kali Linux is the primary tool for cybersecurity professionals and ethical hackers. It is literally how the security industry trains its next generation of defenders. These are not side projects. These are not hobbies. These are critical tools for digital freedom, national security, and human rights worldwide. And now here is the loop that this regulation creates, and it is one of the most self-defeating ironies in recent technology policy history. If American developers can no longer freely distribute cybersecurity-focused Linux distributions because they contain penetration testing tools that fall under controlled technology definitions, two things happen almost immediately. First, the American cybersecurity industry loses the open source pipeline that trains its next generation of talent. The very people who defend American networks learn on these tools. Remove the tools, you hollow out the talent pipeline. Second, development of those tools moves offshore. It goes to jurisdictions with no export control concerns. Jurisdictions where American oversight and American security standards no longer apply. The law, in trying to protect American security, directly undermines it. But wait, because there is a legal dimension to the story that almost nobody is covering, and it changes everything about how this fight might play out. In 1999, a case called Bernstein versus the Department of Justice established something critical. Source code is protected speech under the First Amendment. The government cannot simply ban the publication of code without facing serious constitutional scrutiny. That was a victory for open source developers everywhere. But this new framework does not technically ban publication. It requires a license before publication. That is a deliberate legal maneuver. The effect on developers is essentially the same. Your code does not go online until the government approves it, but the legal path to challenge it becomes much narrower and much harder to walk. This kind of drafting does not happen by accident. It is engineered to achieve a policy goal while surviving the constitutional challenges that a blunter approach would not. And the political timing makes it worse. We are in a moment where technology competition with China is treated as existential by both major American political parties. Any politician who pushes back on tighter tech controls risks being painted as soft on China. That pressure is enormous, and it silences people who know better. Meanwhile, the open source community is fighting this through comment periods, regulatory filings, and legal briefs. The right tools, but slow ones. And the regulatory machine moves faster than most people expect when political will is behind it. Linux is not an American project. It is a global one. Debian has contributors from more than 50 countries. The Linux kernel is maintained by developers on every inhabited continent. If American regulatory frameworks make it legally risky for Americans to participate in these global projects, developers may start withdrawing. Not because they want to, but because their lawyers tell them they have to. Consider what actually runs on Linux. The majority of web servers, the majority of cloud infrastructure. Android runs on billions of smartphones. The International Space Station runs Linux. Most of the world's supercomputers. The systems managing power grids, water treatment, and traffic lights in cities around the world. This is not a niche software policy decision. It is a decision with real consequences for global infrastructure. And the way the damage would actually unfold is not the dramatic collapse most people imagine. It is something quieter and much harder to fight. There will be no single announcement. No 600 distributions taken offline overnight. No clean headline. What happens instead is a chilling effect. Developers get uncertain about their legal exposure. Maintainers consult lawyers, get scared, and quietly shut projects down. Hosting platforms start restricting what they serve. Companies shift to distributions backed by large corporations that have already cleared the compliance hurdles. The ecosystem does not die in a dramatic collapse. It slowly suffocates. One project goes quiet, then another, then a third. No single day it all changed. Just a gradual narrowing of what is possible, a slow erosion of the commons that took decades to build, replaced by corporate software that costs money, restricts freedom, and serves shareholders rather than the public. The people who built Linux did so with a specific philosophy. Software is knowledge. Knowledge should be shared. The ability to inspect, modify, and redistribute the tools that run your digital life is a form of freedom that matters as much as any other. That philosophy built the internet. It built the cloud. It trained the very AI systems that the regulators trying to control it are now afraid of. The regulation rests on a premise. Controlling the distribution of advanced software reduces the risk that adversarial nations acquire dangerous capabilities. That premise sounds logical until you look at it closely. China has its own Linux distributions. Russia has its own. The world's most sophisticated state-level cyber operations are not run on tools downloaded from a GitHub repository maintained by a volunteer in Ohio. They are run by well-funded teams with capabilities that no export control regime is going to touch. What these controls actually do is raise the cost and legal risk for small independent developers and security researchers doing the most innovative open work. They protect nobody at the top of the threat model. They devastate everyone at the bottom. This pattern repeats constantly in technology policy. Broad regulations written to address elite-level threats end up crushing the people they were never designed to catch, while the actual targets route around them without blinking. There is a better path, but it requires something that is in short supply right now. There is a version of the story where regulators, legal advocates, technologists, and the open source community find a way to write rules that actually target the real threat without destroying everything else. That version is possible, but it requires three things: policymakers who genuinely understand what they are regulating, not surface-level briefings; real technical literacy, the kind where you know the difference between a kernel module and a large language model, and why that difference matters for how a rule should be written; an open source community willing to engage in political organizing with the same discipline it applies to writing code. The community is exceptional at solving technical problems collectively. It has historically been poor at navigating legislative processes. That gap has a real cost in moments like this one. And public attention. Because regulators respond to pressure, and right now, most of the public does not even know this conversation is happening. You do now. Let's zoom all the way out, because this is really about something bigger than export regulations and Linux distributions. It is about who gets to participate in building the digital world. For 30 years, the open source model has been one of the most democratizing forces in the history of technology. It is why a teenager in Brazil can learn to code with the same tools used at the world's largest companies. It is why a journalist in a repressive country can communicate safely. It is why security researchers everywhere can study and expose vulnerabilities in systems that affect billions of people. That model was not inevitable. It was built by people who made deliberate choices to share rather than hoard, to publish rather than lock away, to trust the collective over the corporation. The threat we are discussing is not the first that model has faced, but it is one of the most structurally dangerous, precisely because it uses legitimate concerns about real risks as cover for a framework that, if poorly written, would do far more damage to open collaboration than to any adversary it claims to target. And once the infrastructure for licensing and compliance is built, history shows it tends to expand. What starts as a targeted control on sensitive AI systems does not stay there. It migrates through bureaucratic momentum into adjacent categories, one by one, until the compliance burden is woven into everyday software development. The developers who built the internet did not ask for permission. They wrote code, shared it freely, and trusted that the communities forming around it would govern it better than any centralized authority could. That bet, made by thousands of people over decades, produced the infrastructure the entire modern economy runs on. The question being decided right now, quietly, inside the Bureau of Industry and Security, inside congressional offices, in regulatory comment periods most people will never read, is whether that model gets to continue. The answer depends, in part, on whether enough people know the question is being asked.